Okay, welcome back. We're on page 105 talking about the components of the security education, training, and awareness. So these terms are similar, but they have different, scope. The whole idea, awareness is all about just keeping people informed. You know, Training is about specific members, um, trinkets and security slogans and posters, that kind of stuff for awareness, little campaigns and stuff. Now, training is, perhaps some detailed stuff. Maybe like on your first day of at work, they gave you a little thing. Maybe some video instructions. And then education is specific. Like, okay, you just got hired as a whatever, and therefore you require this specific stuff. Some formal training. Okay, so I mentioned that you don't always have to do all this stuff on your own. So on page 107, they talk about blueprints, models, and frameworks. They have like a fill in the blank one. You here's a security, policy or training or whatever, and you just kind of fill in the blanks. There's a few to choose from for the ISO standard, ISO 27000. By the way, it's not free. Okay. But you select the type of controls you want, implement, and develop your own guidance. NIST, which is publicly available, so there's no charge. And it's rather large, and there's a gazillion of them. And quite frankly, it could be kind of overwhelming on the amount of choices you have. In supplemental materials, I included a couple of them. I included the NIST publication SP 800-12, which is an introduction to information security. Obviously, that's just an intro. 171, which is protecting controlled unclassified material. And then 100, which is information security handbook, a guide for managers. It's kind of sort of geared for managers and not necessarily, technical people. Okay. And so there's an awful lot of NIST stuff out there. So this is, for example, the things that they say you ought to do in the right order. Prioritize and scope what you're trying to do. Orient the scope of the cybersecurity program. Make sure you had the line of business and, business need first, all that stuff. Create the current profile. Where are you now? And then do a risk assessment of what we have now. Is it good? Is it bad? Is there risk? And then create a target profile of where you want to be. And then, analyze and prioritize the gaps that you find between what you, currently have and what you're trying to get to, right? And then you implement the plan. It's pretty straightforward. On page 113, they talk about the security architecture. They have these goofy little diagrams called the spheres of technology. So I'm not going into too much detail here, but the point of all this is, do you start from the outside in? Is that how you design these things, or from the inside out? In other words, do I start with protecting the internet and then the network and then the systems? Or do I start with information and determine that? So, kind of interesting, huh? So the idea is that, for internal threats, man, again, it's all about, training, education, and awareness. There's not much else that you could do. I mean, a disgruntled employee is going to get you no matter what. But anyway, all the rest of the stuff, where should you start? That's the kind of cool thing. And so they talk about the levels of control, managerial control, right? That kind of makes sense. Security design, risk assessments, control reviews, those things you sit around, a conference room table and come up with. The operational controls, we're talking about personnel hiring and firing and physical controls, locks and gates and input, output, that kind of thing. And then technical things, identification, how are you going to do that? How are you going to do authorization? How are you going to do accountability? How are you going to do cryptography? Those kinds of things. So defense in depth, you've probably heard this from other security things, but it's all about, you don't just have one thing that holds the bad guys out. You have to have series of things like this diagram here. I mean, you don't just put a firewall at the internet and says, okay, I'm done. No, you need to harden the network and you need to harden the systems and, safeguard the information. A great non-technical analogy for defense in depth is you're building a ship. And you could have just the hull of the ship. And if it hits something and pokes a hole, the ship's going to sink. Or you can put individual watertight compartments. So if the hull of the ship gets, the primary, defense mechanism gets compromised, it might flood one compartment, but it's not going to take the whole ship down. Okay? So that's defense in depth. You don't just have one giant single hull. You have multi-hull plus watertight compartments. So in this case, we're talking about, employing training and controls and auditing to make sure everything works. There's another figure talking about this. And so this is their example. It's a technical example where I have the untrusted network, and then I have a DMZ. Hopefully you've seen this maybe before. If not, wait, we're going to come back to this. Where I have a dirty, the untrusted, then semi-trusted, and then trusted over here. Anyway, so that's defense in depth. I don't just have one thing. I have multiple layers where packets get inspected. Perimeter defense. Okay, so perimeter defense, a lot of people in the early days of computer security thought that's all they needed. I'll just put a firewall out there and I'm done. Like, wow, that is so naive. Okay. So a perimeter is any place where one network touches another. For example, in this particular case, there's a perimeter right here from the internet to the DMZ, from the DMZ to the inside. Okay, so those are tightly controlled and perhaps just one location, without regard to redundancy. I'm talking about, the firewall setup here. You have an external filtering router and an internal filtering router. Kind of a thing. They're saying router, I would say firewall, but it's probably a single device that does all those functions. Okay, we have made it to the end of this chapter. And I'll see you guys again in the next chapter.